Today I want to talk about the future, specifically what doing the Every Nation mission might look like in our new reality, in our what's called our new normal, in our COVID-19 world that seems to have no end in sight. It's so easy and so common, especially during times of uncertainty and rapid change, for any number of important and urgent issues to push us, to nudge us, to bump us, to pull us slightly off mission. And this can happen on a daily or a weekly basis. And if we're nudged a little bit off mission, a little bit more next time, we wake up one day and we are way off mission. This message is an attempt to answer several questions that spiritual leaders all over the world are asking. Sometimes they're asking, sometimes they're just wrestling with these questions. There are various forms of this big question, like this. How can we stay on mission in a time of uncertain work and worship routines, in the pressure of unresolved racial issues, and in the midst of unjust governmental policies? Here's another version of the same question. What must stay the same even when, or especially when, everything around us seems to be changing? And in its simplest form, how do we lead in today's world? I want to answer these questions by looking at three familiar passages in the book of Matthew. Let's start with Matthew 4, verses 18 through 22. Matthew 4, 18 through 22. Here's what it says. While walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Immediately they left their nets and followed him. And going on from there, he saw two brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, in the boat with Zebedee, their father, mending their nets, and he called them. Immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. How do we lead in this new world order? How do we lead in the midst of uncertainty? How do we lead into this confusing future? Number one, leave your past. We see these people, the first disciples Jesus called, and very clearly he called them to follow, but in order to follow, they had to leave. And what it says in verse 20, immediately they left their nets. And then down in verse 22, speaking of James and John, immediately they left the boat. It wasn't their boat. It says the boat. It was their dad's boat and their father. They didn't even have anything to lead. No matter what you're leading, no matter where you're leading, no matter how you're leading, there is this thing of leaving your past. Of course, it's the core of what it means to follow Jesus. It's the core message of discipleship. I think sometimes we're way too hesitant to call people in a discipleship context to leave their past. Sometimes we're too timid to lay out the demands of the gospel. But I want to take it to a leadership level. As these disciples are following Jesus, they had to leave. There's stuff they had to leave behind. I know all of us have, maybe it's going to work in the morning, we get halfway there and we realize we left our coffee, or we left this, or we left that. Usually it's not worth going back for because we're on our way somewhere else. There are some things we leave behind that we have to turn around, our computer, our Bible, whatever, we have to go back. This idea of leaving your past, it's not just leaving the trivial. It's not just leaving things that don't matter. Obviously, in this context, there's leaving behind sin to follow Jesus, to be a leader. But it's also leaving behind dreams and visions and securities and sometimes income streams and sources. Leaving the past and following into the purpose of God will also require us to leave relationships. Yeah, we all know we leave bad, toxic relationships. But there are some relationships that are going to be left behind because those people are going a different direction. They're not going where you're going. These people, they left to follow. And again, applied to leadership and leading in uncertain times, there is always a leaving the past. It's not leaving everything. It's not running away from the past, but there is a leaving. These guys left their nets. They wouldn't need those nets the way they used to need them. They needed other things. They wouldn't need that boat, although there was a time later on when they actually did need a boat and Jesus stood there and preached, but on a day-to-day basis, they didn't need that. No matter how painful it is to leave some things in the past, here's the truth. God is only calling you to leave stuff in the past that you don't really need anymore. Emotionally, that may be difficult. Relationally, that may be difficult. Financially, that may be difficult. But it's going to work out in the end as we continue to follow Jesus. Leave it in the past. It's what He's calling us to do, and it's what our message is to others without hesitation. Secondly, I want to turn to Matthew chapter 16. I want to look at another very familiar passage, Matthew 16. And then again, this is Jesus talking to disciples. So we look at the beginning of the discipleship journey, we look at the middle of it, and then we're going to look toward the end. Verse 24, then Jesus told His disciples, if anyone would come after me, here's this idea again of following Jesus. Let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses it for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? So, if we want to lead into the future, number one, we have to leave the past. Number two, we have to lose our life. Again, it's a requirement of discipleship, but it's not a one-off thing. It's not, okay, well, I did that 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, 5 years ago, whatever, when I started following Jesus. I already left my past. I already lost my life. This is in the middle of the discipleship journey, and Jesus is still telling them, you want to follow me? Lose your life. I think as leaders, we need to preach that to ourselves as much as we need to preach it to others. If you want to lead into an uncertain future, it will involve losing your life. What He says here is if you want to follow me, pick up that cross and follow. I'm thinking about writing a book on this called Your Best Death Now. We're so sometimes concerned with our life that we don't understand that part of the spiritual life is a death. Part of it is dying to self. Pick up a cross and follow. The cross, we all know this. We've all preached this. We've all studied this. We've all read this. We've all lived this. But a reminder, the cross was an instrument not only of death, but an instrument of execution, but not only execution. The cross was a slow and painful and torturous and sure death. In that day, if you saw one carrying a cross, you knew that was a dead man. It was only a matter of time. No one did that on purpose. No one did that voluntarily. No one looked forward to that. It was not comfortable. It was not nice. It was not something anyone got excited about, but it was nevertheless, in this text, something required. Pick up your cross and follow. And then He uses this phrase, losing your life. Losing self, losing life, letting go and letting things die. I think about Romans 12, 1 and 2. When Paul picked up the same idea and he talked about laying our lives on the altar as living sacrifices. And it's not, with the cross, it was demanded by this violent, corrupt Roman government. And it was put on people. But Paul takes it a step further and talks about putting yourself on the altar as a living sacrifice. In fact, Jesus is saying here, hey, you go pick it up. Take it up every day, because part of leadership in any context is about losing your life. Certainly in these times of uncertainty, certainly in times that we're heading into and leading into. It's very important that we are reminded that part of leadership is laying down our lives for others. And Jesus said it like this, greater love has no one than that we lay down our lives for others. And that's certainly the core, not only of discipleship, but leadership. So you want to lead into the future. There is this laying down of life and letting go of the things that even give us life sometimes. The next one, the third scripture I want to look at is in Matthew 22. Now we're toward the end of Matthew. We've looked at the beginning, the middle, and the end. Let's look at verse 34. But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. He didn't really want an answer. He was trying to test Jesus. Verse 36, here's the question. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. To lead in these uncertain times, to lead into the future, the question is, how do we live this mission that God has given us in the midst of all of the uncertainty? How do we do it? Number one, we leave the past. Number two, we lose our life. Number three, we love our God. No matter what the future holds, to follow Jesus, to be a disciple, to make disciples, to be a leader, a spiritual leader, at the core of that, at some level, has got to be a love for God. At some point, if we're not doing this out of a love for God, we're just going to quit. It doesn't make sense to do it for any other reason. Loving God. And what he says is, well, all the heart, soul, the mind, the strength. When we're calling people to discipleship, we're calling them in a core way to love God, not to do stuff, not to a program, but to a relationship with God. When we're calling people into leadership, we're calling them into a relationship with God. As we lead, it is so important that the love of God is right in the center. Why are we doing what we're doing? I know every leader listening to this right now, from the very beginning, you started out on this journey because you love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. You've made amazing sacrifices. You've made painful sacrifices. You've made unreasonable sacrifices because you love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. But at some point, sometimes we get so busy with leadership stuff. We get so busy with leadership tasks. We get so focused on really good things, and we wake up one day and the love of God's not in the center. It's somewhere back there. It's somewhere out there. It's somewhere we're thinking, I do love God. But as a real presence, sometimes that can slip away. Let me encourage you, leaders. Whatever you're doing, if it's not connected and motivated by and rooted in and flowing out of loving God, then we need to question whether we need to do it. Or maybe we need to question the way we're doing it. Or maybe we need to question the timing or really the motive. But it's got to be rooted in the love of God. The greatest commandment, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then finally, this is still the same passage, but it'll make our last point. Verse 39. And this, so often Jesus not only answers the question we ask, but he answers the questions we didn't ask, but we should have. So the question was, what's the greatest commandment? Jesus clearly answered that, love God with all your heart. But he doesn't stop there. And I'm so grateful, sometimes it's painful, but I'm so grateful that Jesus tells us not only what we want to hear, but what we need to hear. He not only answers what we thought to ask, but often he answers what we're afraid to ask. And so here's the second part that they didn't ask. Verse 39, and a second is like it. This is the bonus answer. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commands depend the law and the prophet. Now, love your neighbor as yourself. If we want to be leaders in the world we live in, then part of that leadership, right at the foundation, is a leaving the past, losing our lives, loving our God, but it's also loving our neighbors. What if Jesus literally meant your neighbors? I know there are multiple ways to interpret this idea of neighbor and what does it mean to love your neighbor. And our minds jump immediately to the parable of the Good Samaritan, when the question was, well, who is my neighbor? And so Jesus kind of framed the racial and ethnic tensions and the one ethnicity that didn't like the other ethnicity and one ethnic group that looked down on another. And Jesus told that parable that elevated the one that was outcast and made really in the eyes of the Jewish Pharisees and Sadducees, the wrong person was the hero of the story. It was the Samaritan who was the despised ethnicity and the looked down upon, the marginalized. So yeah, there's certainly the idea of loving our neighbor means loving people who are different than us, loving people that we don't really like to associate with, and loving people that maybe our culture looks down on and our culture keeps at arm's length, and loving people that maybe our society and our educational level and context, and we kind of think we're better than them. Certainly love your neighbor means that, but what if it actually means your neighbor, the person who lives across the street, the person who lives on the same floor in your high rise, the person who lives on your right and your left and next door to you and behind you? Maybe it means that too. I have neighbors that have moved in this year in my home in Nashville, on my right and my left. I've got new neighbors on both sides. And Deborah and I both go out of our way to get to know our neighbors. I sometimes, in all this work at home time we've had, I'll look out of my window. When I see one of my neighbors out there on either side, I will drop what I'm doing and go out there and make up an excuse to start engaging. And we're talking about having dinner together and trying to ultimately show love to my neighbors. What does it look like to love our neighbors? And it is the direct flow of loving God has got to connect with loving our neighbors. And what he says here is love your neighbor as yourself. As you lead, that leadership flows out of a love for God, but it has to manifest in a love for people. I love the way Robert Mulholland describes and defines spiritual formation. So much writing on spiritual formation is helpful, but it takes us deep in our relationship with God, and that's a good thing. It's a great thing. But Mulholland stretches the description and the definition a little further in his book, Invitation to a Journey. He says that spiritual formation is, like everyone else says, this process, this lifelong process or journey of being conformed into the image of Christ for the sake of others. Everyone who talks and writes about spiritual formation talks about the habits and the disciplines and the patterns that help our souls, our lives, become conformed into the image of Christ. But Mulholland adds that comma. He doesn't put a period there. He puts comma, for the sake of others, for the benefit of others. If I'm really growing in Christ and if I'm being conformed to the image of Christ, and yet I am obnoxious and selfish and angry and indifferent toward my neighbors, whether it's my literal neighbors on my right and left where I actually live, or whether it's my neighbors like the parable that are of another ethnicity, of another culture, of a people that my people don't connect to your people. Either way we look at neighbor, our spiritual formation being formed into the image of Christ, or as I'm talking about today, loving God should result in loving our neighbor. And if all we do is love God and love God and love God and love God, but it doesn't change the way we treat others, I'm not sure we're really loving God the way Scripture says. So, in summary, when we think about the future, look, I'm not a prophet, I'm not a futurist, but as we go into this uncertain future, we think about how to do mission in the future. I want to go back to the past. No matter what the future is, if you're going to be successful leading into the future, you're going to leave your past, lose your life, love your God, and love your neighbor. As I close, I want to think about some questions. Number one, as I lead into the future, in this crazy world we're in now, what do I need to leave in the past? Obviously, bad things, time wasters, sin, bad attitudes. But there are also some really good ministry methodology that probably needs to be left in the past. Not the core mission, not the values, not the culture, but there may be some methods that worked before and they worked gloriously, and now they're just not going to carry us into the future. So what do I need to leave in the past? Second question to think about. What does it mean for me to lose my life for the sake of others? What part of my life do I need to deny? What does it look like to pick up my cross and follow Jesus? To lay my life down, to deny self. We live in a world that's always trying to find self. Well, if that's what you're doing and the people you're leading, as soon as they find self, make sure they pick up a cross and deny self. How can I love God? How can I love God in the midst of an uncertain schedule and everything's been disrupted? You know, there are habits that enhance and deepen and grow our love for God. There's the habit of corporate worship, and that's been disrupted. But we've got to figure out how to do that. I appreciate online worship services, but they are not the same. There's the habit of daily devotional reading and prayer and hearing God. How can I love God? And finally, how can I love my neighbor? Whether that neighbor is the person who's different from me or whether it's my literal physical neighbor. Practicing leadership in 2020 has not been easy. It's been tough. I don't know if it'll be any different and any easier in 2021. But here's what's encouraged me. I've looked at the way my co-laborers, my colleagues, my close friends around the world have led during the crisis in front of them, and I find great hope and great encouragement. It has been some of the most creative, some of the most selfless, some of the most fearless and faith-filled leadership I've ever seen in my life. And so while I don't know what is out in front of us in the future, I know the people who are leading that I'm working with around the world are going to figure out a way. And they're going to do a great job, and God is going to be honored. It really is a privilege to work with, to walk with, to lead with all of you who are working in leadership in every nation all over the world.